Welcome today to the Global Chamber of Commerce video podcast. Today we have Richard Pound, Canadian Olympian, member of the International Olympic Committee, and a resume that goes on and on and on. We're going to talk today with Richard about the Olympic movement, businesses' involvement in the Olympic movement, and his perspectives on how the games have changed since he first became involved and continues to be involved. So, Richard, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation, and let's see where the conversation goes.
That's the idea. So tell us a little bit more about yourself other than what I briefly mentioned.
Well, my path to the IOC is kind of unusual. My father was an engineer in the pulp and paper business in Canada, and after the war, he accepted a position in a small, stinking town in northern British Columbia, which had one unusual feature, which is that the city, the town fathers said, sooner or later, everybody's going to fall either in the ocean or in the lake above the dam that provided the water power. And so they got the profits from what they called the beer parlor and built a 60-foot pool, indoor pool, because the weather was awful. It had to be indoors. And instead of just hiring somebody to keep the chlorine in the water and sweep the decks, they hired a swimming coach. And the upshot of that is that from this little town where there were maybe 300 kids, there was at least one swimmer from the town, which was called Ocean Falls, on every Canadian, Pan American, Olympic, and Commonwealth Games team between 1948 and 1976.
Wow!
And I was part of that. The string. We stayed in Ocean Falls till I was 14, and then my father got hired back east again, and we spent a year in Three Rivers and then Montreal. So I've been in Montreal since 1956. And the one thing I had learned about living in a small, stinking paper town was that I was not going to be an engineer if that was the reward you got for being a good engineer. And I met one of the first women CPAs in British Columbia who told me what CPAs did. So by the time I was 11, I knew I was going to become a CPA. I went to McGill in furtherance of that particular objective. And about halfway through the commerce degree, I thought, it might be smarter to add something to this as kind of a hedge against obsolescence. And the two routes at the time where you either went into law, combined accounting and law, or you did an MBA. And I kind of liked the concept of being a professional, so I opted for the law. And at the end of getting my CPA, the ink was hardly dry on the paper when I enrolled in the law school at McGill. And at the end of all of that, chose law, and my specialty, to the extent that you have one, is income tax, because I didn't break into a nervous sweat every time I saw a financial statement. So after that, I went to the Olympics in Rome, and I went actually was at the Pan American Games in Chicago in 1959. Olympics in Rome in 60, and then I went to the Commonwealth Games in 1962, Australia, and did well there.
What? Tell us a little bit about the Rome Games. You're a youngster. You go in, or are you just awestruck by the whole process?
Oh yeah, I'd never been out of North America, so you come down through the clouds over and say, oh my God, there is a Colosseum, there is a Vatican. You can see all these things. That was pretty exciting, and an awful lot of different feet have trod those streets, as you can imagine. So it was great fun, and certainly kept me. I was a finalist in the 100-meter freestyle, and we had a relay team that came fourth. So that's But one of the things I've done since I became an IOC member is I've always presented the medal in my event, the 100
Oh, that's
freestyle.
fabulous.
So starting in Los Angeles in 1984, with Rowdy Gaines won the 100 free. I've presented the winner with the gold medal all the way up to and including Tokyo.
So I think that medal presentation is in the movie on the LA Olympics, 16 Days
Oh,
of
really?
Glory. So you're
Wow.
you're a star in the film. Apparently, I'll have to
a
go
non
back
a
and watch
non
it now.
a non-speaking part.
So how did you go from Olympian to being a member of the IOC?
Well, a good question. I think I always felt, because it was a very volunteer-driven movement at the time. You know, there wasn't the money in amateur sport, and there wasn't the infrastructure for it. So I thought, well, you know, if you've drunk from a well that somebody else has dug, you got at least a moral obligation to put back into it at least as much as you took out. So I started volunteering at swimming meets. I was a sprinter, so I was a good starter, and I knew when people were trying to jump the gun and so on. And then I became, because I was an accountant, I became the treasurer of the Quebec section of the Canadian Amateur Swimming Association, as it then was. And at one point, I was at the club, very famous club in Montreal called the Montreal Amateur Athletics Association, which helped spread sport through the northeast of the U.S. as well. I was having lunch there, and one of the mafia that ran the Canadian Olympic Association came over and said, "Young Pound." I was Young Pound, and I said, "Yes, sir," which is what you said in those days. Said, "You're a chartered accountant." That was the Canadian version of CPA. Oh yeah, I said yes, and he said, "You're going to be a lawyer." And I said, "Well, if I pass my bar exams next spring, yes." And I don't know what signal passed between him and the other members at the table, but he said, "How would you like to be the secretary of the Canadian Olympic Association?"
Wow.
So now I've been now in university for about 8 years, and so I'm very well spoken. I said, "Gee, that would be swell, you know. What do I have to do?" And he held up his hand. He said, "Young man, you leave that to us." So in April of 1968, I became the secretary of the Canadian Olympic Association. And lo and behold, 2 years later, Montreal won the right to host the 76 Olympics. So, and our president was out in Vancouver. So there I was in the host city at age, I don't know, 28 or something like that, essentially running the host National Olympic Committee. And after, yeah, no, it was tremendous fun. And at the end of the term, we had a term limit for president, 2 terms of 4 years each. So when the current president had to retire, I became the president. And I think a year later, I was the Olympic protocol in those days was you couldn't have more than one member in any particular country unless your country had hosted the Olympic Games. So we had now hosted the 76 games and became, sort of in quotation marks, entitled to a second member. I was in the host city. I was an Olympian myself. I had the double professional qualifications. And my only problem was that I was regarded generally as too young. You know, you take it out and get seasoned for another 2 decades or something like that. Anyway, they took a chance. The IOC took a chance on me, and the Canadian Olympic Association did too. So I got started in the business of the Olympics when finally the penny dropped. Partly after Los Angeles, seeing the enormous money that's available if you've got a good product. And we decided that instead of leaving all the negotiations to the organizing committees and then taking a share of that, it was too important. we needed to get involved, and the president of the day
So
wanted to
let me just stop you there to clarify. So before Los Angeles, there was pretty much not a major sponsorship program whatsoever in any way, shape, or form. It was fairly small and low key. And then Los Angeles came in and sort of enlarged it to large corporations, mostly American, but a few multinationals, to get them to get involved. And then at some point after those games, the IOC decided that it wanted to take some of that responsibility from the host cities and do sort of an international sponsor gig. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the the television deal was exceptionally good. The sponsorship, Peter's idea of cutting down on the number of sponsors. There used to be hundreds of sponsors for various games, all
Ah,
all little pieces, and all built all around the games. And what he did is say, let's cut down the clutter, and we'll make big deals. And I think one of his first ones was with Coca-Cola, and that was one of these things where it was a natural, and we had sort of primitive categories too. I mean, that was like film and credit cards and things like that. So it was first steps. But Peter's vision of getting a smaller number but
and
bigger.
This is Peter Uberoth, correct?
Peter Uberoth, yeah, and that was a good start, and we started to pay attention to that because it looked like a model that had some potential, and it led to what is called the top program right now, which it sounds fancy, but it actually just means the Olympic program. And we envisioned, after discussion with sponsors, very interesting. Many sponsors said, "Listen, we love the Olympics; they're absolutely wonderful, but you're too hard to do business with, and that's not what you want to hear." So we said, "What's the problem?" They said, "Well, if we wanted to become an Olympic sponsor, let's say we're Coca-Cola. If we want to become an Olympic sponsor, we've got to make a deal with the organizing committee for the Winter Games, the organizing committee for the Summer Games, and with the National Olympic Committee of every country in which we want to activate our sponsorship."
Okay.
And there's a bell curve of experience where there's some very experienced sponsors and they know what to do. Others had no idea. So we said, well, boom, penny drops. He said, what if we could put everything together in a single package where you'd get the two organizing committees, you'd get the IOC itself, you'd get all of the National Olympic Committees. And they said, wow, that would be fantastic. And then we said, well, what if we also made it exclusive so that nobody in your product or service category could claim any association with the Olympics? Well, they thought they'd died and gone to heaven. And that was the beginning of the top program and the beginning of the IOC stepping in to say, wait a minute, we own the television rights. We have to manage that. And I remember I got a call when if I ever write a book, I'll say it started with a phone call. Phone call was Juan Antonio Samranch, and he said, Deke, it was Deke, you're now the chairman of our television negotiations committee. And I said, I don't know anything about television rights. He said, no, nobody does. But it's our biggest asset. We've got to figure out how to manage it. So I became the president and our chairman of this committee. And we thought, well, why don't we go and talk to the broadcasters? And we said, what? Because the next games coming up after Los Angeles were Calgary, the Winter Games in '88. What would make the rights more valuable to you? And they said, well, for one thing, we'd like the Winter Games to be as long as the Summer Games. They were about 3 days shorter in those days and we said, well, the program's a little thin. And they said, so you can add some events. duh, hadn't we thought of that? And so we talked to them and talked to them and talked to them, and finally we sent each of the networks of the. We figured ABC, NBC, CBS were all big enough and able enough to handle those. So let's have we'll have an auction, and so we did that, and we got I think $309 million for a winter games. It was just unheard of. But it showed to us that first of all you have to start thinking a little differently, because you're not just a rights holder. You're a partner. You're trying to make the product as good as it can be. And we had a whole bunch of things to throw into the mix that we hadn't really realized. I mean, we had pretty well all of the Olympic films from historically. We had a bunch of literature. We had a lot of souvenirs and things like that. And the brand that we had to invent was, it was sports-centered, international, peaceful, the youth of the world, aspirational, stuff like that. All qualities and features that would be attractive to businesses. And it also gave us a chance to, as we figured out the brand, things we shouldn't do. I mean, we should not have a tobacco sponsor. We should not have a liquor sponsor. We should not have anything that doesn't reflect the Olympic values. And so we built quite
so let's go to 21st century now and look at that perspective. And so we have a lot of companies going green, and B corporations and things like that are now sort of becoming the standard. So is there a movement within the IOC to sort of give those companies who might be applying for the top program sort of a little bit edge, because they are those kinds of companies, to the exclusion of your traditional companies that you would think of from the 70s? Has been any movement in that direction?
Yeah, there's certainly been a leavening of stuff like that, where we're not really in high industry stuff. I can't remember whether we still have a fossil fuel sponsor. Probably not at this point. But it's interesting. You get held to all kinds of weird standards. For example, you get people criticizing having Coca-Cola as a sponsor because they have sugar drinks, and so the focus on what Coca-Cola products get identified with the games has changed to waters, to juices and things like that, rather than a fizzy Coke. And we got a lot of flack over time about our fast food sponsor, McDonald's, which is very good, has been a very good sponsor.
And they're not doing it. They're out of that program, correct?
I don't know whether they've decided to renew at the end of this. And one of the things we did was make long-term agreements, not just Olympiad by Olympiad, so that they got a sense of ownership, and they're prepared to promote the games without saying, "Oh, if I do this and you go to A&W, I lose all of the benefits." And so we're saying, "No, we'd like to have a steady, devoted clientele." And what we did in the top program was basically limit the number of those worldwide sponsorships to initially to 10.
Wow.
It goes up and down once in a while to 12 or something like that. But so there was a sense of exclusivity and of camaraderie between the sponsors. Lots of commercial deals between them were fostered by their mutual interest in the Olympics. So it's been a very interesting experience, and we've learned a lot about it. And instead of sitting back, your arms folded and say, "What have you got for us?" say, here's what we've got for you. Here's the information and the brand work that we've done, showing that if you don't just put a label on your product or service, but if you show that you're helping the games to be organized, you're helping young people prepare for the games, consumers are prepared to pay a little bit more for the product or service. So it was a real education for us as well. That if you're a partner, and my deal was this: we've got to put in at least as much as we get from our sponsors. We've got to contribute to make it, to add value to that sponsorship, and so it's been pretty good. And the television, as it's expanded, become more sophisticated and more compartmentalized, has increased, I don't know, 1,000-fold or something like that. It's just amazing.
You're the only member of the IOC that I know. Tell us a little bit about the IOC and maybe how it's changed since you originally got involved to now. I don't really know too much about it. So I think our audience would really like to know what you could share without going into any secrets.
Well, when I joined, it was very much, it was men only. There's not a single woman. Very heavily Eurocentric. I mean, every president except for Avery Brundage has been a white male European, and that's something that's I think on the cusp of changing. But no, it was very formal when I joined. Basically, they said, you're the youngest member, age-wise, and recent appointment. Just pay attention to what's going on, and maybe for the first 10 years you don't say anything at meetings. Lots of luck. So that has evolved. So I think I was elected in 1978. The first women, there were two, didn't come on board until I think 1981, and we had one Spanish lady from Venezuela, of all places, really, macho South America, and the other was a Finn. Both well-known athletes, and so that's expanded. We've got gender parity on the field of play at this point. Paris will be the first absolute 50-50. We're only up to about 20, somewhere in the 20% of having women on board. So
is it less Eurocentric than it was?
Somewhat, but no. The core, if Europe wants something to happen in the Olympics, it can happen, and that's something that it can be problematic. It's also not all bad, because there's an awful lot of sport practiced at high level in Europe. It's not the only place, but it's a concentration. I'd say probably north of 50% of the Olympic athletes are European.
So when you were negotiating the television rights in this auction, I want to hear a little bit more about how that happened. I mean, was it by signed ballot? Was it a silent auction? Did people just submit proposals and you picked the highest one? How'd you go about that analysis?
Well, we've kind of invented a process, and we had the three networks, and we said we'll indicate the level at which we're looking for bids, and you can match that or not. Actually, let me go back a little bit. Because the IOC was coming into the television business for the first time in respect to the Calgary Games. The issue is, when should we have these negotiations? Because the Winter Games before Calgary were in Sarajevo, and we knew that the United States was not going to do very well in Sarajevo. I mean, ABC was the broadcaster that had been in place for quite a while, was selling Sarajevo as Miracle on Ice, Take Two, Lake Placid, and we said no. The U.S. is going to get killed in Sarajevo. It's going to be a bummer. So we should have the negotiations before Sarajevo. Well, Calgary was being advised by Mark McCormick organization, IMG, or at least their television arm. And they had this anal retentive view that the longer you held on before making a deal, the more valuable the rights became. And we were trying to say to Calgary, that's dead wrong. It's going to be a disaster. Well, they said that's what Mark McCormick says. I said, I'll tell you what. How much does McCormick say you're going to get? So $209 million. I said, fine. We'll round that down to 200. You guarantee us our share of 200 million, and you can have the negotiations whenever you want. Well, all of a sudden, the Calgary Organizing Committee said, oh, look, we're just a little organizing committee. We can't afford to take that kind of risk. I said, folks, you can't have it both ways. If you don't trust your television advisor enough to follow the advice that it's giving you, then you'll have to negotiate when we want to negotiate. And so with a lot of rug scuffing and grumbling about dictatorial IOC, blah, 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 we decided to have the negotiations before Sarajevo. Now we get to the thing, and we got the three networks, and we said, all right, we will accept written bids. Oh, the other thing we did, which was kind of funny, you appreciate this as a lawyer, we gave each network a draft of the proposed contract, and took their comments, and anyway made an amalgam of the comments and said, okay, this is the contract against which you'll be bidding. And the deal is you have to sign the contract, leaving only the amount blank, with a letter authorizing me to fill in the amount for the winning network. And so more grumbling, but anyway. So we had we said, we will accept bids in excess of $200 million. And all three of them submitted bid. ABC was the highest, and we didn't agree to accept the first bid. So we said, all right, next round, we will accept bids in excess of $250 million. CBS dropped out at that point, but NBC and ABC was being run television-wise by Roone Arledge at the time, who was a real Olympic and sports guru, and they bid in excess of $250 million, as did NBC. So we had another round, and we said we would accept bids in excess of $250 million. And now we're getting nervous because that's probably more money than the rights were worth. Anyway, ABC bids $300 million, and NBC exceeded the 250, so it wasn't eliminated. And finally, we said, all right, I called them all in. I said, look, guys, you've gone much higher than we ever expected. So we'll have, and we can't make a decision like that. So we'll accept bids of $300 million or more. The ABC goes away, and they call back in the room, said, so if we bid the 300 million that we just bid, we're still in. I said, yes.
Yes.
Lo and behold, NBC bids 300 million. So we got them back and said, all right, we can't break this tie. you guys have to settle it. We're not going to. Here's the deal. We'll have a bid now every 15 minutes. And the only deal is you've got to bid $1 million more than the previous high bid.
Just like an auction.
Oh, it was anyway. NBC went first, and they actually asked for an extra 15 minutes so they could check with New York. They came back and they said $304 million. ABC did the same sort of thing and basically said, we see you're 4 million, we raise you 309 million. So that's how we got to this huge amount. And the grumbling from Calgary dropped off noticeably because it was $100 million more than they even dared to hope. And we were right. The Sarajevo games were a disaster for the United States, and it would have been a much, much lower auction had we waited.
I think your perspective, though, about trying to, with the TV rights as well as the sponsors in general, to let them see that you're being a partner and that you're not trying to get them to pay something for nothing, but that you're working hard to create a brand. And that applies not only in the Olympics, but in any other situation where you've got a manufacturer and a distributor, to those relationships. And I think the emphasis on building that brand and indicating that, the sponsorship agreement is just the beginning, not the end, and that we're going to work tirelessly to keep this product pristine is a super perspective.
No, it resonated very well, and with the right kind of sponsors. So it was an experiment and kind of a learn as you go, but it touch wood, it's worked out very nicely. So
you've been to a lot of Olympic Games, probably more than many people alive. So congratulations on that. So I'd love to hear maybe 3 things that you have seen change since the Rome Olympics, from a very, very high macro level. They may be good, they may be bad. In what are we looking at? 60 years of Olympics.
Well, I think the first and most major change is the amateur code, that came from Avery Brundage and his predecessors, came to an end. I mean, I remember when I was swimming, I couldn't take a job in the summer as a lifeguard because the old amateur code was, if I had a job at a pool, I had an unfair advantage over somebody who didn't have a job. I said, I'm sitting in a chair.
You could have a job as a busboy. You could have a
Yeah,
job at a restaurant.
exactly.
Okay.
And so that took a little time to evolve, but the machinery was at work, and by I think 1986, the way we bridged that was to say, if you're eligible to compete in the world championships in your sport, organized by the International Federation, you're welcome at the Olympic Games. So that did away with all this thing. And I think the last sport to get in on that basis was tennis, and it's been very popular as an Olympic sport as well. So that making it possible to train as much as you need to do for the Olympics. I mean, think of when I was there, you couldn't train for more than 30 or 60 days, according to the amateur rules. And as the degree of skill and strength and speed increased, that just wasn't realistic, and it discriminated against the poor and the working classes.
You need to make a living.
Yeah, so there was that.
So today, are there any of those kinds of restrictions? I mean, I remember even in our '84 games, we had professional athletes playing basketball. So is there any area where that's still a limitation on what these athletes can do anymore?
No, not really. As long as the you follow the rules of your international federation.
But they're pretty lax in that regard. relative to the old days?
Yeah, it's just it's become a non-issue,
Okay.
one of the things that has accelerated a little bit since really it started in the post World War II era of in sports like weightlifting and the throwing events in track and field. It was actually the veterinarian community, not the medical community, that said, "Listen, we can beef up cattle. We can certainly beef you up." And so all of a sudden the shapes changed. Weightlifters were not these big guy with flabby tummies. They were all cut, and they'd say, and interesting enough, there were no sports rules that prohibited. The only drug legislation was in the recreational stroke criminal side of things. So yeah, they trade. Oh, how much are you taking Diana ball? How many milligrams? Blah 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 blah. And so they changed notes until actually the start was in Rome, where I was a Danish cyclist died in one of the road races, and partly because he was filled with amphetamines. So the old Ubas said, "Oh, you're not supposed to come to the Olympics and die. You're supposed to come and have fun." And so they formed a medical commission, the IOC, with a doping and biochemistry subcommission. And the mandate given to that subcommission was to find out what the athletes are taking, and what are the chemical properties, and what are the side effects? Is this dangerous to their health, and so on. And then that led to the creation of a list, famous capital L list, which was first introduced at the Grenoble Winter Games in 1968. And that was the beginning of testing at the Olympic Games. And that was the only competition where there was drug testing. For many, many years, we eventually, persuaded most of the international federations to do drug testing, but only at their world championships. And none of them, there was a lot of territorial testosterone going on. They wouldn't allow the IOC to test their athletes other than at the Olympic Games. So it took a long time and the rules were all over the place, different lists, different penalties, different processes. And that was what led to eventually to the formation of the World Anti-Doping Agency, was one of our, which I was the founding president of it. And our challenge was to harmonize and standardize all of the rules and the processes and the lists and the sanctions and everything like that. And it was a 50-50 combination of the sport movement on the one hand and governments on the other. And it's another unique experience that has worked pretty well for the last 25 years now.
It would seem like there could be a lot of pressure from both countries as well as federations to indicate that either your drug testing capabilities are wrong, or that there's a flaw in the test, or that this is a cultural thing. It seems like that there's lots of room for pushback, that they might try to strong arm the committee to say that these athletes should participate.
Well, there was a lot of reluctance in forming it, but we had come in on at the back of the so-called Festina scandal in 1998, where the French police were arresting members of the Festina team and entourage they had industrial quantities of doping substances and the means of administering it, and so we proposed. I said, look, we've got to do something about this, and we suggest that we have this organization that will involve governments and sports. We'll harmonize the rules. We'll have research and all that sort of stuff to find out what's going on. And we had an international conference in the center of the universe, which is Olympic-wise is Lausanne in Switzerland. and said, here's an idea with it that we'd like to see whether there's any uptake on it, because it's a problem that is getting out of control. And we got a so-called Lausanne Declaration. Yes, that we would go ahead, and we did. And I remember the government representatives wanted to meet, and they had wanted 50% control, and we had envisioned somewhat less when putting this conference together. They said, no, 50%, or we're out of here. So I said, give me 15 minutes. I went down to Sam Ranch and said, the governments want 50%. And he said, I told you we should never have had this conference. And I said, no, it's a better idea than mine. And he said, why is that? He said, well, if they have 50% of the control, they're actually going to have to do something instead of just sitting on the sidelines carping about the shortcomings of the sports movement. And secondly, if they've got 50% of the control, they can damn well pay 50% of the costs, which otherwise we would have had to pay. So back I went to the government. I said, you really insist on 50% and not none of this, at least 50%. They said, yes. I said, you've got it. What? I said, no, it's a good idea, a wonderful idea. Only two things. First is, we don't have time to proceed at the glacial pace you folks have perfected in international negotiations. We got to be in the field January 1st, 2000, testing for the Sydney Games. Okay, so now we can meet that, and to give credit where credit is due, by November of 1999, we had the World Anti-Doping Agency created. And I said, and the second thing is, if you've got 50% of the control, you've got to pay 50% of the costs. Well, the hand wringing would be, this would be a rounding error for a municipal budget, not 160 or whatever number of countries we had at the time. Anyway, much wringing of hands. And I said, I'll tell you what, we'll pay the first 2 years, but starting at the 2 cheapest years, by the way. I mean, the whole budget was maybe $8 million. It's now in excess of 50. Anyways, but starting in year 3, you've got to pay. And again, to give credit where credit is due, they've got to had an allocation, a percentage allocation on a continental basis. Europe started off, I think, at 45%. The Americas 20%, Asia 20%. And Africa, a very small percent, but it was important for them to pay their way as well. So
absolutely,
that's been a remarkable success.
Well, congratulations. So you're off to Paris in a few days. What are you most excited about getting to Paris and seeing the Olympics again for what will probably be your 10th Olympiad?
At least, yeah. Well, I as an old swimmer, I like to see swimming, but there are a number of fantastic sports. I remember I was the assistant chef de mission of the Canadian team in Munich, and Montreal was having the 76 game. So I came back and said, "Hey, what tickets should we sign up for? So swimming, gymnastics, track and field." And I said, "Yes, so those are all good, but think about volleyball." Say, volleyball? I said, no, trust me, it's not the game you thought you were playing in high school. This is a very exciting sport. And sure enough, the volleyball finals in Montreal, Poland beat the Soviet Union, and I forget exactly who won the women's, but anyway, it's the most exciting things of all. Nadia Comaneci got the first perfect score in gymnastics. You had the Sugar Ray Leonard and all the U.S. boxers, along with Teofilio Stevenson from Cuba, who would have, if it hadn't been for the L.A. boycott and the Korean boycott, he would have won about 6 straight heavyweight boxing championships. He was just splendid. So, in a sense, to go and watch any sport played at the highest level is kind of fun. And I remember the dream team. The dream team didn't actually come about until Barcelona in 1992. Right. And it was an interesting progression. It wasn't a question of the NBA banging on the door. It was the International Basketball Federation said to it itself, you can watch all of the movies of Michael Jordan and so on that you want, but unless you're out there on the court getting faked out of your shoes, in real life, you're not. The level of play is not going to improve. And so it was, in 1992, the only issue in the tournament was who was going to play the U.S. in the finals. 1996, pretty much the same thing. In 2000, the U.S. got to the finals against Australia. I mean, think about that.
Yeah, all right.
And then in 2004 in Athens, the U.S. didn't even get a medal.
Wow.
So I think they got a little cocky about we could just send college teams and they'll beat these guys, but you got 6'8", 6'10" Serbians and so on, and they were learning that they're actually contributing players to the NBA itself. So anyway, so all of that is kind of fun. Archery now has been turned into not a whole bunch of people shooting arrows at butts, but like a gunfight at the OK Corral with clocks and so on, and having to. So it's the format of the competitions has changed to make them more interesting. It's hard to work up much enthusiasm for sailing. It worked in Sydney because you had Sydney Harbor and you get a lot of people around to see it. So those kind of challenges of making your sport interesting and relevant for current audiences and younger audiences has been a challenge for many of the sports.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I think we all learned quite a bit about how this whole process works and the evolution of the Olympics over 5-6 decades now. So we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well,
and we wish you a great time in Paris.
Look forward to it.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay.